Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another live stream on History Podcast. And tonight, I am moderating a debate between David Pallmann and John Winford. And the debate specifically about which gospel came first. Did Matthew come first or did Mark come first? Dave will be taking the position of the Griesbach hypothesis, that Matthew came first, followed by Luke, and that Mark used both. John will be taking the two source hypothesis position of Markan priority, and also the position that Matthew and Luke use Q, and that Matthew and Luke use both Mark and Q, but Matthew and Luke did not use each other. And with that being said, thank you both for joining me tonight and for debating here. And Dave, I'll give you 15 minutes for your opening statement.
All right, starting right now?
Yep.
All right. Okay, well, I hold to a rather unpopular position within contemporary New Testament studies. I believe in Matthaean priority, the thesis that the canonical Gospel of Matthew was the first of the synoptics to have been written. Specifically, I believe in the two gospel or the Griesbach hypothesis, which can simply be expressed as a solution to the synoptic problem, which proposes that Matthew wrote first, Luke wrote second, and Mark wrote last. This position stands in contrast to the currently dominant theory of Markan priority, which affirms that the Gospel of Mark was written first. In this debate, I will defend Matthaean priority against Markan priority in 3 steps. First, I will argue that the patristic evidence overwhelmingly and unanimously supports Matthaean priority. Second, I will argue that the most common arguments for Markan priority are abysmal failures. And finally, I will argue that factors internal to the Gospels of both Matthew and Mark demonstrate the priority of Matthew and the posteriority of Mark. We begin with the patristic testimony. While it is largely neglected in contemporary synoptic studies, the early church had quite a lot to say about the composition of the 4 Gospels. There are even plausibly some disagreements among the patristics regarding matters such as the order in which the Gospels were composed. But they are all agreed on one matter, and that is the priority of Matthew's gospel. So here's the question. If Mark was written prior to Matthew, why do all of our earliest witnesses claim the opposite? You might be tempted to think that all of them are copying from one another, or from some earlier, now lost tradition, but that's not plausible for at least 2 reasons. First, there are the aforementioned disagreements or discrepancies among the witnesses. These shouldn't exist if all are copying from a common source. And second, there are good reasons to affirm the independence of at least our 3 earliest witnesses, Irenaeus, Clement of Alexandria, and Papias. That last name might raise some eyebrows, since there is a myth that Papias's remarks preserved by Eusebius in Ecclesiastical History 339 actually support Markan priority. Nevertheless, I am fully persuaded by Charles Hill's case that Eusebius preserves a more detailed paraphrase of Papias's gospel tradition in Ecclesiastical History 324, where he clearly asserts the priority of Matthew. Mark Goodacre attempts to explain the unanimity among the patristics by suggesting that they all assumed that Matthew was written first because they assumed that Matthew, the tax collector, had been the author of the gospel, and so surely the apostle must have written before Luke or Mark. But there are 2 further problems with Goodacre's reasoning here. First, the idea is utterly foreign to the patristics themselves. They never give the impression that they are trying to determine the order of the composition of the Gospels by inference. Instead, they report it as something known either by direct testimony or by tradition. Second, the patristics also invariably place John as the last gospel to have been written. If the premise is that the patristics correlated priority with apostolicity, then John should not invariably be placed last. So we return to the original question. Why do all of the earliest witnesses claim that Matthew was written first? I propose that the best explanation is simply that they were right. Matthew was the first gospel to have been written, and the paucity of these alternative explanations for the unanimity of the patristic witness to the priority of Matthew should only increase our confidence in the truth of their testimony. But surely synoptic scholars are well aware of this patristic evidence, right? So why doesn't it sway them? Well, the patristic evidence is typically dismissed as unreliable because the evidence for Markan priority is supposed to just be overwhelming. But is it? Time precludes me from covering all of the lame arguments which have been put forward in favor of Markan priority, but I'll discuss just a few of them here. The argument from order. Matthew and Luke very rarely agree together against Mark in their pericope order, and some have thought that this indicates Markan priority because it supposedly suggests that Matthew and Luke are more or less following Mark's order. Of course, this argument is completely reversible. It can just as easily be argued that Mark is following Matthew or Luke's order, except for when he is following the other synoptic. The argument from Semitisms. Supposedly, Mark contains more Semitisms than Matthew or Luke, and this supposedly indicates that Mark is closer to the actual events and therefore earlier. Not only is this statistic probably false, with Matthew containing a far higher number of Semitisms than Mark, but even if it were true, a high number of Semitisms likely tells us more about the ethnicity of the intended audience of the gospel than it does about its priority. The argument from Christology. Supposedly, Mark has a far lower Christology than Matthew or Luke, which supposedly indicates that Matthew and Luke improve Mark's Christology. In the first place, it's debatable that Mark genuinely has a lower Christology than the other synoptics. But even if true, this argument assumes that high Christology had later origins than low Christology. But this is obviously false, since Paul's writings undeniably predate Mark, and Paul already has a very high Christology. The argument from editorial fatigue. Supposedly, Matthew and Luke contain continuity errors, which can be explained by their dependence upon Mark, since they allegedly make some sort of change to Mark's narratives, and then later forget that they have made this change, and end up copying some of the original details back into their own narratives, thereby betraying their dependence upon Mark. But these putative examples of continuity errors overlook plausible harmonizations. This argument also assumes that the gospel authors have motivations which are contrary to the ones expressed by the gospel authors themselves. It further ignores the fact that many of these putative inconsistencies can be explained in reverse by Mark fixing continuity errors within Matthew and Luke. And finally, it requires us to believe the implausible thesis that Matthew and Luke are such lame brains that they forget their own changes to Mark, usually within just a sentence or two later. So given that the evidence for Markan priority is not actually very strong, I propose that we reconsider the patristic testimony. But the case for Matthaean priority doesn't stand on the testimony of the patristics alone. There are numerous indicators within Matthew and Mark which similarly point to this conclusion. The first of these is the phenomenon of conflation within Mark. In 17 different instances, Mark appears to alternate between Matthew's narrative and Luke's narrative, containing portions from one and then the other gospel. It's hard to see why Matthew and Luke should choose to independently preserve just those portions of Mark which had not been preserved by the other writer, especially if one thinks that Matthew and Luke are independent of one another. I will give just one example of this. Consider Mark 1, 29 through 34, the story of Jesus healing Peter's mother-in-law. Jacob, if you wouldn't mind putting up the visual I sent you before.
I just put it up.
Appreciate it. In this example, I've colored the text from Matthew blue and the text from Luke red, while coloring Mark blue where he agrees with Matthew and red where he agrees with Luke. This, I hope, will provide a vivid visual illustration to viewers of the phenomenon we are dealing with in Mark. Notice how, in addition to exhibiting alternating agreement between Matthew and Luke, verse 32 in Mark also exhibits redundancy, saying, "Now when evening came, after the sun had set." The phrase, "now when evening came," follows Matthew, and the phrase, "after the sun had set," follows Luke. These are essentially just two ways of saying the same thing. Redundancy is a known characteristic of conflation, making a conflation of Matthew and Luke probable here. Furthermore, the case becomes even more compelling when we consider that the Greek phrase, translated here as "when evening came," is a rare expression. It is used only 7 times in the New Testament, 6 of which are in Matthew's Gospel, and the other time is here in Mark. So clearly the phrase is a distinctive of Matthew's style, making it more likely that Mark is borrowing the phrase from Matthew here than the other way around. Now, I can't go through all 17 examples of this here, but hopefully you get the idea. Mark looks very much like he is blending Matthew and Luke together in these places, which is much better explained on the hypothesis that he wrote last. You can take that down now, Jacob. Thank you. Further evidence of Mark's dependence upon Matthew and Luke can be seen in Mark's abrupt ending. It's quite strange that after predicting Jesus' resurrection appearances, Mark just ends without actually relaying them. It's very hard to believe that if Mark was the first to record the life of Jesus, that he would just leave out the resurrection appearances to possibly never be recorded. On the other hand, if Mark already knew that these appearances were recorded in Matthew and Luke, then at least this issue disappears. And as a final point, observe that the author of Matthew's Gospel displays a greater interest in numbers and in money than do the other synoptics. Matthew's unique material tends to include these sorts of references with much greater frequency than do the other synoptics. And yet
5 minutes.
There are a few places, such as the story of the widow who gave the 2 copper coins in Mark 12, or the reference to an ointment being worth 300 denarii in Mark 14, where Mark makes a specific reference to money and Matthew does not. So given that Matthew is the author with the clear preference for including these sorts of details, it's not clear why he wouldn't have included these details when they were present in Mark, unless it was the case that Matthew was written prior to Mark, and so the author of Matthew did not have access to those details. All in all, there is considerable internal evidence for Mark's dependence upon Matthew and Luke, and therefore against the priority of this gospel. Now, the case which I have built so far indicates not just that Matthew was written first, but also that Mark was written third. And this leaves us with a burning question, which I will try to address with my last remaining minutes here. Namely, why does the Gospel of Mark even exist? In other words, if Matthew and Luke already existed, what reason remains for Mark to have ever been composed, given that virtually all of the information contained within Mark is already present within Matthew and Luke? This is perhaps the chief objection to the 2 gospel hypothesis, and so I should say something about it. Now, this objection would be a good one if Mark was intended to be a document which was primarily interested in recording the life and teachings of Jesus. If that were the case, then there really would be no reason for Mark to exist, since it adds very little material to Matthew and Luke on this front. But is that the reason why Mark was written? I propose that it is not. Following Ward Powers, I propose that Mark is intended to be early Christian kerygma, as opposed to Matthew and Luke, which are intended to be early Christian didache. Now, if those terms aren't familiar to you, think of didache as teaching material and of kerygma as preaching material. The difference lies in the intended target audiences. Whereas Matthew and Luke are intended to preserve information about Jesus for believers, Mark is intended to declare the gospel to unbelievers. Powers argues for this thesis at length in his excellent book, The Progressive Publication of Matthew. And indeed, Clement of Alexandria tells us that Mark was written for this exact purpose. So once we appreciate that Mark has a different purpose than Matthew and Luke, then it is no longer mysterious as to why this gospel should have been written. This gives us greater insight into the nature of Mark's gospel, and it also removes the most serious objection to the 2 gospel hypothesis. Due to the time limits inherent within debates of this sort, I have had to be overly brief in my presentation of the case for Matthaean priority. But I've only covered a sliver of the evidence here. I refer interested viewers to my own channel, where I have a 5-part series detailing a more fully rounded case for the priority of Matthew's gospel. But even if I have not convinced everyone that Matthaean priority is true, I at least hope that I have shown that it is not an unreasonable or indefensible position, as it is often made out to be in contemporary New Testament studies. And with that, I will yield the rest of my time. Thank you.
Okay, John, you want me to get your presentation up right now?
No, you don't need to put it up. I'm going to start going through some of it, and some of it I don't need to address right now anyway. So I'm only gonna pick through it. So
let me know when you want to put up let me know when you want to put up the slides when you want.
Yes, sir. Markan priority.
Right, 15 minutes.
Markan priority. It's just more plausible that Matthew copied Mark than the other way around, and the vast majority of scholars agree. The case for Markan priority against the apologetic rhetoric of Matthaean priority. The problem here is he has to prove two different things for me. He's got to provide an extra amount of evidence that I don't feel that he has to do this. The debate is one based on academia and the best scholars' opinions that exist today. Thus, it would require very strong evidence, far from what my friend can produce, to substantiate his claims. And let's not forget, he has two major claims to overcome and substantiate to even start to deal with Matthaean priority. Number one, traditional authorship, which is anti-academic and known as apologetic rhetoric, which no credible university teaches today. And number two, an early dating of Matthew and Mark, which by all academic standards are generally dated at 70 CE for Mark and 80 to 85 CE for Matthew. Both of these would have to be addressed fully before you can try to put Matthew at an earlier date than the war. The Gospels are all compilations that we would not have if these texts were from real Aramaic followers of Jesus. There are no known examples of Koine religious textual history where scribes are minimizing textual traditions of whole books. In fact, the textual traditions only exist as growing accretions, as we see taking place in Matthew and Luke, who use the Markan traditions for the core of their books. These scribes and authors were far removed from Jesus' ministry, just like the Markan traditions were. In fact, the Markan text was not even known as the Gospel of Mark when it was first authored, or any other gospel for that matter. What we see in Mark with three different endings, all applied at a later time, far beyond the compilation date, the book also grew accretions, never shortened. This took place much the same way as the Gospels of Luke and Matthew added their accretions to the Markan traditions. All of the Gospels, including the synoptic texts, were anonymously written originally, because they were not from any known follower of Jesus, and all of these Hellenistic communities that compiled, copied, and wrote these texts were far from Jesus and his ministry, and any real follower of Jesus himself. We can substantiate this claim in part, as academia does, due to the limited amount of Aramaic transliterations in all the Gospels. If his Aramaic followers used a scribe, you cannot hide said transliterations. What we see are Hellenistic texts from Hellenistic communities who heard and believed these valuable stories that may have originated in Israel 3 to 5 decades after crucifixion. The war changed the way most early Christians met and shared traditions. No longer could Hellenistic Jews and proselytes and Gentiles share traditions they learned in the Passover crowds, numbering 500,000 people at minimum for the 30-odd years that the temple stood before the war, making a number of 30 million people that went in and out of Jerusalem after the crucifixion and up to the time we lost the temple. If we count the 3 major festivals each year, we see 1 million people coming in and out of Israel each year, and we do not have a single tradition today that can be applied to a real follower of Jesus. As a matter of fact, we don't have a single word in a city full of scribes from the Jerusalem church. We only have a tradition where Paul claims he argued with Peter, and they parted ways after having no agreement. This change in how early Christians practice and proselytize due to the war, it created a direct need for written text. They needed the text to preserve perceived valuable Christian traditions that were shared in the Passover crowds, orally and written traditions. They needed text to combat perceived heretical traditions and a very direct need to have written text to proselytize their new faith over the perceived heretical traditions being practiced in many different sects of early Christianity. These texts were not biographies from eyewitnesses to Jesus or his ministry. These texts were selling one version of Jesus' story with multiple Christologies in each book that existed. And we only have them today because they were the most popular textual traditions of the time, coming from a sea of traditions that existed in the Roman Empire. And let's make note that Matthew is usually listed first because it was the most popular book. It was also, because of its popularity, the patristic fathers all thought that it was first, but they argued about so many different things up and down. There is no external evidence that supports priority one way or another. They don't help. There was no single center of Christianity that originated in Jerusalem. In fact, there were many centers all over the Roman Empire. This is not what we should see if Jesus' Aramaic followers took their message to the Roman Empire with a home base in Jerusalem. If the real Aramaic followers had authored anything, their names would have been applied to the text from the very beginning. But what we see are the titles and names being attributed at a much later date to these anonymous texts, and given to what later Christians viewed as the most likely candidates for each book. This was standard practice for the scribes copying said text. The scribes were all trained in Aristotelian rhetorical prose, which required scribes to use famous names like Matthew or Mark for titles. It was done so to build authority and divinity in the anonymous text. Matthew is actually mentioned in the Gospel of Matthew, but the author gives zero indication that he is talking for himself. This actually comes from Mr. Ehrman's site, and I don't want to be labeled as somebody who doesn't give credit where it's due. Matthew shows up in a single verse. He is a tax collector, Jesus called to be his follower, who drops everything to do so in Matthew 9:9. Read the verse. Does it sound like it is a self-reference any more than any other verse about any other people named in the narrative? The author appears to be talking about someone else. That seems unlikely if it was meant to be a self-reference. From one of my Latin friends and scholars, Rafael Gomez has a question. There are 3 different versions of Jesus and different Christologies of Jesus in the synoptics. If the stories originated from real followers and a central origin point like Jerusalem, why are there multiple versions of Jesus where there would be only one if originating from traditional authorship? And so I had to throw that out there from my friend Rafael Gomez. Conflation is not a credible discussion, knowing the Markan text is a compilation, and we do not have original text as written. Besides multiple redactions, we have copies of copies of copies of copies, with many changes and accretions that grew as scribes made more copies. Mark shows 50% of these conflations, both from Luke and Matthew, as our guest pointed out, which have equal numbers that do not provide any evidence for or against Matthaean or Markan priority. Conflation is one of many required topics to overturn Markan priority. Alone, even if successful, would not substantiate Matthean priority. And in the end, it's a neutral argument and only perceived as helpful by our apologetic friends. The fact Luke and Matthew share Markan traditions and Q traditions is a prime example of how scribes often copied and compiled traditions. While this is non sequitur for priority, it does go directly against authorship from a traditional source, eroding the possibility for Matthean priority. To add to this, the Synoptic Gospels are full of negative polemic against Jesus' real followers, making traditional authorship an impossible task to accomplish. As far as external evidence, the earliest reference to all 4 Gospels that calls them by name ascribed to them now is from Irenaeus against heresies, written around 185 AD, and the Muratorian fragment written around 170 to 200 AD, over a century after Jesus' death. Justin Martyr, writing 30 years earlier than Irenaeus, from the same location in Rome, loosely quotes the Gospels, but does not give them any of their modern attributions, suggesting that these attributions were made at some point between 150 and 180. So it really, and as far as external evidence from the patristic sources, they argued so much about different aspects in Christianity. None of them agreed with each other. So cherry picking which argument you would like to stand behind is simply not a credible argument that's used. And there's just as much criticism as there is positive evidence in each. In conclusion, Markan priority does not hinge on a single piece of evidence. Exactly like the historical Jesus, most scholars see his historicity is due to the total evidence in support of such. And that Jesus' historicity is very solid. We cannot say Jesus historicity is weak because of his lack of any one piece of evidence. This is the same for Markan priority. It's not a weak opinion based on weak evidence. Like Jesus' historicity, it has overwhelming support of the brightest minds that exist today in biblical scholarship. When we look at all the evidence and knowing it is more likely to add to the simplicity of Mark than it is to simplify Matthew, which in itself does not pass the smell test, Matthaean priority will remain only in apologetic circles due to faith, want, and desire, more so than perceived evidence in favor of such. And that finishes my my discussion for right now. I'll yield the rest of my time.
Okay, David. 10 minutes rebuttal.
All right, so I'm not sure if John thought we were having a debate about the topic of the priority of Matthew versus Mark, or the traditional authorship of the Gospels, because most of his criticisms, or most of the points he made, seem to me to be directed against the thesis of traditional authorship. Which I do affirm the traditional authorship of the Gospels. Happy to have that debate. I certainly think that's a defensible position, but it is strictly a separate debate from the topic of which Gospel was written first, which we can assess without making any presumption about the authorship of the Gospels, as far as I'm concerned. And in my opening statement, I certainly tried not to do that. None of my arguments depended on the thesis that the Gospels were in fact written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It's almost hard to respond here because we didn't actually get much of anything in the way of arguments for Markan priority. We didn't even get the stock arguments for Markan priority. We got a statement that Markan priority is more plausible. Well, plausible to whom? Plausible to John. Okay, clearly not more plausible to me. And we have an audience trying to make up their mind on this. And a statement that it's plausible is not an argument that it's true. So it would be nice to, get an actual reason that might make Markan priority plausible to someone. And unfortunately, and with all due respect to John, I saw nothing with respect to that. The closest we got was an appeal to scholarly consensus. I grant Markan priority is the scholarly consensus, but it's not universal. I can cite scholars who disagree with this. And, we're not here to debate what do most scholars believe on the matter. Obviously, I will grant most scholars affirm Markan priority. Obviously, that's not going to be a reason to think that it's true, because that's just going to be, an ad populum fallacy, textbook example of an ad populum fallacy. Let's see. He appealed to the mainstream dating of the Gospels and said that's something I'd have to deal with. The issue here is that dating of the Gospels is going to always presuppose a particular solution to the synoptic problem. Just about any book you'll read on the dating of the Gospels is going to say, well, before we date the Gospels, we're going to have to, say something about the synoptic problem, because that's going to be critical in determining sort of where you date any particular Gospel. You're only going to be able to date, Matthew and Luke. Say you can get like the date, 70 or later for the Gospel of Mark. You're only going to be able to date Matthew and Luke later than 70 if you have already, determined that these are dependent on Mark. If it goes the other way around and Mark dates to around 70, then it's just going to show you that Matthew and Luke predate 70. So I think that ends up being a circular argument. We got a lot of stories, a lot of very interesting stories in John's opening statement, but I guess the question for me was, what is the evidence for them? I'm happy, that's what John believes, but I would like to know, what are the reasons to believe that this is true? Let's see. Matthew is listed first in the patristics because it was the most popular. Well, I agree, but why is it the most popular, right? That's a question we would want to raise. Presumably, they didn't just arbitrarily sort of glom onto the Gospel of Matthew and say, yes, that's our Gospel. Matthaean priority can actually explain why it's the most popular Gospel among the patristics. It was written first. It's the one that, had been that had been accessible to Christians for the longest period of time. That's why it was the most popular. Matthaean priority actually has an explanation for why the Gospel of Matthew is the most popular among the patristics. So saying they listed it first because it's the most popular doesn't tell us anything about why it's the most popular. And I think the theory of Matthaean priority actually has some explanatory power there. John did address the issue of conflation a little bit. I would have liked to see a little bit more detailed interaction with the argument from conflation. He said it doesn't establish Matthaean priority. Strictly speaking, I agree with that. What it does establish, though, is Markan posteriority. So what it will certainly falsify is the position that John is defending in this debate, because it does definitely show us that Mark is the last of the synoptics to have been written. And so then it just becomes a question, okay, well, if Mark is last, then Matthew and Luke are prior to that. Which of these two is first? Obviously, patristic testimony is going to clearly weigh in favor of Matthew being prior to Luke. And I think factors within Luke itself will argue in favor of this. Luke explicitly states that there are gospels prior to his, for example, in his prologue. So Matthew definitely comes out as being the more likely of the two. And I mean, as somebody who is affirming the two source hypothesis in this debate, John should certainly agree that Matthew predates Luke. So while, yes, conflation by itself doesn't get you all the way to Matthaean priority, it absolutely debunks Markan priority. And I think once you sort of weigh the relative evidence between Matthew and Luke, Matthew comes out far ahead. John claims that Irenaeus is our earliest source, who names all four Gospels. That is a common claim. I think it's just false. I'm fully persuaded by Charles Hill's case that Eusebius records a fourfold gospel tradition from Papias of Hierapolis in Ecclesiastical History 324. Happy to make the case for that. But if that argument holds, then Papias, who is by all reckoning is earlier than Irenaeus, he names all four gospels by the names that we know them by. And of course, I'm sure we'd have a disagreement about where exactly to date Papias, but I think we would both agree that he's far earlier than Irenaeus. Let's see, we have disagreements among the patristics. This is true, we do have disagreements, but we don't have any disagreement over the priority of Matthew. And so the question I would say that raises for me then is sort of why? It's clearly not because they're all on the same page about everything, right? They're not all just copying from each other, right? It's not like Papias said Matthew was written first and everybody copied from him. We know that. Why? Because they all disagree with each other on things like, what is actually the order of the Gospels? When were they written? Things like that. And so if they're not all copying from one another, we have this question of why do they all agree on the priority of Matthew? And my argument would be that the best explanation is that they're telling us the truth, that Matthew was the first gospel to have been written. I think that's about all the points that were raised. So I'll yield the rest of the time over to John.
All right, John, 10-minute rebuttal.
Awesome, thank you. It's interesting too. It's a good discussion that he brings up about the evidence. And in researching this briefly, what I found was that there's probably 10 or 15 different topics that all affect that are considered evidence. And everything that I would say, this is what I believe in, he could counter with a very decent argument against it. Again, there is no smoking. It's just like Jesus' historicity. There is no smoking gun of evidence that you can discuss and say, well, this is the evidence that truly proves it. It's not. It's the totality of evidence in support is why the majority of scholars think what they do. And the reason that I focused on traditional authorship, it is required if you're going to place, because when you say Matthean priority, you are moving that gospel from 80 to some unknown date, which you never even discussed which date that you feel it is. And you're getting close to a traditional authorship. And in the very beginning, you had stated which synoptic problem you stood behind, which actually stands behind traditional authorship. And so for me, if I fight traditional authorship, I'm fighting that it wasn't written by him because it came at such a later date. There was no Matthew behind it. He had no connection with it. And that affects, it erodes and I explained in my opening that it does erode the Matthean priority by attacking the traditional authorship. So that's what I have to that. And let's see here. Yeah, the patristics were they were far removed from any knowledge. So it doesn't matter what they say. We're talking 100 years later. I mean, 70 years later, their names, the traditional authorship names, weren't even being used. So I don't find any external, again, the external evidence really, he makes good points, but it's nothing that's going to apply. That, again, in the very beginning, I said he needs extraordinary evidence to overturn it's almost a complete consensus here in my favor. And he needs to come out with something strong to overturn this. And I don't think that any evidence exists to do such. And the external evidence is well criticized. So it's really not helping him as far as what he's trying to accomplish. He can believe what he wants, but we need strong evidence, not a 50-50 cut, not even a 60-40 cut. Even if it was in his favor, which it's not, it still wouldn't help him to overcome the Markan priority that exists today. So I think that's all I need to say for that.
Okay. Dave, 10 minutes rebuttal.
All right. I'm not sure if I'm going to need 10 minutes to respond to all of that. Let's see. I agree that there are implications for traditional authorship of the Gospels. So, I can agree with that. Obviously, if, we're dating Matthew earlier, that's, going to make it at least puts it into the realm of possibility that Matthew could have been the author. Whereas, like, if you want to date it, super late, then, obviously Matthew the tax collector would have been dead by then. So, I mean, obviously, there are implications of this debate for the issue of authorship. And I would agree with that. I mean, honestly, that was the reason I got interested in this debate in the first place, was because I was, interested in the topic of authorship of the Gospels. But let's not confuse there being implications for that with those being the same thing, right? Even if, right, Matthew, let's say, it dates to the 40s or 50s, which is where I would want to place the Gospel of Matthew personally. Even if it dates to then, that doesn't automatically mean Matthew the tax collector is the author of it. So those are separable issues. So even if I accepted all the arguments that you gave against the traditional authorship of the Gospel of Matthew, it could still be the earliest gospel written. And the same applies if we date the Gospels super late. Say we put them like all into the 2nd century. It can still be the case that Matthew's the first one written and not by, the tax collector Matthew. So it is very much a separate debate. Let's see. You say all of the external sources are far removed. I don't think that Papias is far removed, and especially so if you want to date the Gospels as late as I think you want to put them. I will date Papias possibly as early as the late 90s AD, or very early 1st century. I'm happy to make that case. And if you're dating, the canonical synoptic Gospels later as you want to, that's actually going to put Papias very close to those. Now, of course, there is a response position for mine. Obviously, the earlier I want to place the Gospels, the further removed that does make Papias from them. But Papias gives us his own source for his information. He identifies him as John the Elder. I'm happy to argue that that's John the Apostle. John the Apostle is certainly early enough to know who's writing the Gospels. And that's going to hold no matter where you want to date them. So I don't see that as being a big issue. I think our sources go back fairly early on that point. Clement of Alexandria is also pretty early. And I mean, yeah, Irenaeus is probably writing 100 or so years later. I actually think Irenaeus can be dated a little bit earlier than he's typically dated to, but wherever you want to put him, 100 years after the fact that's not terrible by ancient standards. That's not super bad. And then, I mean, again, we're pushed back to the question of why do all of the external sources agree on this? And then even leaving the external sources aside, I mean, I listed numerous internal factors factors, which I believe support it, right? We've got unique terminology to Matthew's gospel turning up in Mark, right? We've got we've got examples of Mark exhibiting alternating agreement between Matthew and Luke. We've got distinctive themes and things of the Gospel of Matthew that things Matthew's very interested in his own unique material, which, for some reason are just not included in his account on rare occasions when these turn up in the Gospel of Mark. Very odd that would be the case if, he had Mark's Gospel right in front of him. So all of those are factors which equally support the Gospel of Matthew's priority. And none of that, depends on, you can completely reject, right, the patristic testimony, say that's all bunk, and you've still got those strong internal considerations to contend with. And I would also say, notice here that our entire case has been focusing on the strength of the case for the priority of Matthew. I would want to put a little bit of pressure back on John to be like, what is the evidence for the priority of Mark, right? You say it's not just one thing. It's just all these little things. That's fine, but could you sketch some of those for us? Could you tell us why you think those indicate the priority of Mark? Because this is not just about the case for Matthaean priority that I'm making. You also have a burden of proof here to establish the priority of Mark. And so, while I'm happy to discuss the case for the priority of Matthew, I'd also like to be able to give some pushback on the case for the priority of Mark.
All right, John, 10-minute rebuttal.
Right. Papias. You get into a lot with him. And there is a lot to be said. His writings have not been around for a long time. And if you're talking about Eusebius writing and you're getting Papias from Eusebius, you're already getting text that's 300 years old. I don't think any of his surviving accounts exist as written. And then there's quite the debate on how to interpret his quotations. And it's been a matter of controversy. So I don't think that it's not as clear cut and dry as you say to use him as a source, especially when he's claiming a Hebrew Matthew. You can't be sure that he's even talking about our Matthew. So he isn't talking about the Koine Matthew. Did he know about it? I don't know. If it was written in 80 and 85, did it circulate far enough to reach where he was compared to where it was originally written and compiled? It took a while. It took a while for these texts to get out and get to all the different places. So he very well could be talking about a Hebrew Matthew and not, or an Aramaic Matthew, which is probably what he means by Hebrew Matthew. But you definitely cannot use Papias for such hardcore evidence. It's just not going to work that way. When you're talking about the different evidences, again, you can get into the agreement in parenthetical material, unusual agreements, Mark's shortness, Mark's poorer writing style, Mark's harder readings, Mark's more primitive theology, Mark's apparent lack of information on the destruction of the temple, yet it is noted in Mark 13. You can get into editorial fatigue, as you started to touch on Mr. Goodacre's different opinions. And again, for every one of those I mentioned, there is good criticism against each. So again, there isn't, I'm not going to sit here and discuss evidence that you can come back and make a different case. Again, what it really comes down to is the simplicity of Mark. And it's easier to add to the simplicity of Mark, which is what we see, than it is for Matthew to simplify, for Mark to simplify Matthew. And that again is why Matthean priority is a minority. And that's probably the strongest statement that I can make against it. And again, it's not just that statement. It's the totality. If you look at everything that I mentioned, there's a reason why the most educated people in this have the evidence that they do. Now, I'm not a critical scholar. I'm not into textual criticism. And I think that you're wanting me to cross that line and say things that I don't know a lot about. And I'll be the first to admit I'm not a textual critic, and I don't want to get into, and that's what it's actually required if you want to discuss the details of each of the different things that I mentioned. And I don't think that you have the qualifications either for a proper rebuttal. I do enjoy our discussion. You're a friend of mine. I'm glad that we're having this discussion, and we're getting to air out the basic outline of Matthean priority and Markan priority. But for me, I see Hellenistic communities far removed from Jesus, and I see the war causing a need for written text in Hellenistic communities far removed from Jesus' ministry. And that's why I see the simplicity of Mark. And then I see Mark getting passed around, and I see other communities looking at Mark and going, this isn't enough. We believe in this. And this is what everybody needs to know about Jesus. And so these Hellenistic communities, they wrote about such. And so we get the longer version in Matthew. And Matthew came from a very Hellenistic Jewish community that held Judaism tighter than the other Hellenistic communities, like Luke. And absolutely, you made up a good point. Mark definitely is, he's still speaking to Hellenistic Jews, but he is also speaking to non-Jews. So his text fits everybody. It isn't just for Gentiles, but he is explaining Jewish customs for non-Jews so that they would understand what's going on. I'll yield.
All right, David, 10-minute rebuttal.
All right. So John says that Papias's works have not survived till the present. This is correct. We know from multiple sources that Papias had written a 5-volume work, and for whatever reason, it has not survived to the present day. Which, by the way, is the case with most ancient literature. Most of it has sadly not survived until the present. So nothing particularly unique about that. I know people like Bart Ehrman try to say that there's like something really suspicious about the fact that Papias's works haven't survived to the present, and there must be something suspect about his views. In truth, it's just not that uncommon. Most of what was written in the past has not survived to the present. But this does, raise a good point. Most of what we know about the writings of Papias, particularly what I've, depended on in my case, comes from the writings of Eusebius. So, how do we know that Eusebius is giving us an accurate statement of what Papias actually said? So the first thing to be said is that Eusebius has a pretty good track record on this point, where we can check his citations, because he loves to quote earlier writers and big chunks in ecclesiastical history. He does it quite often, and when we can check him, for example, in his quotations of Irenaeus, he's very accurate in how he records the statements of people. So there's no real reason to suspect that Eusebius is not doing a good job, is that he's somehow, misrelaying Papias either deliberately or accidentally. When we can check him, he gets it right, and that gives us some good inductive evidence that Eusebius is an accurate recorder of these traditions. And a further point I'd add here is against the idea that he would be deliberately misstating what Papias says, is that Eusebius has some rather famous disagreements with Papias over the issue of Papias's millennialism. So if he just felt free, in other words, I guess, to change what Papias was saying, we wouldn't expect these disagreements to come up. We wouldn't expect him to be going after Papias and critiquing him on this front, because he could have just changed what Papias said and made his job a lot easier. So yeah, I don't think there's any reason to doubt that Eusebius is giving us an accurate statement of what Papias wrote. As for this issue of a Hebrew Matthew, I am actually of the opinion that Papias does not say that the Gospel of Matthew is written in Hebrew. The word that's used here is dialecto. It's commonly translated as saying that, Matthew wrote in the Hebrew language or Hebrew tongue. But that word can just as easily mean something like a Hebrew dialect, a Hebrew style, something like that. Uncontroversially, Matthew is the most sort of Hebrew in style of our Gospels. Seems to, as John himself noted, seems to have a, to some degree, Jewish audience in mind. So that would actually be consistent. Scholars like Bernard Orchard and And others have argued that the context of this quotation in Papias actually better supports a translation that something like he wrote in a Hebrew dialect or style. And so that's kind of where I find myself. I don't feel committed to saying that Matthew was first written in Hebrew. I don't think that's necessarily supported in Papias or Irenaeus. Okay, so we did get a kind of scattershot of some arguments for Markan priority here. One is like from the harder readings, and honestly, I think it's kind of cherry picking to point to Mark's supposed harder readings, because we have the same phenomenon in Matthew. A very famous example here is going to be, say, the trial of Jesus, right? We have Pilate asking Jesus if he, really is the Son of the Blessed. And in Mark, we get this very straightforward, like, I am. In Matthew, we get this, like, very cryptic, you say that I am, right? If this was the other way around, if Mark had the cryptic statement and Matthew had the straightforward I am, I mean, the Markan priorist would be pouncing on this, saying, look at this. We have Matthew improving Mark's Christology, right? We have Mark giving this very cryptic statement, and it's so consistent with the messianic secret. And look how Matthew has just improved this, right? Because this is what they say about the other, alleged harder readings. But the point is, it goes both ways. You can read this any way you want, and it's just cherry picking the examples in Mark, in my opinion, to use the harder readings as an argument for Markan priority. Mark allegedly has more primitive theology. I'm very skeptical of these sorts of arguments because it's never really clear how one is identifying that any particular theology is more primitive than another. Usually this proceeds on sort of the assumption that high Christology is something that develops later on. But as I noted in my opening statement, Paul undeniably has, the highest Christology of anyone in the New Testament. I guess you could argue John has a higher Christology, but certainly Paul has one of the highest Christologies of anyone in the New Testament by any measure. And he's also uncontroversially earlier than the Gospel of Mark. So I just don't buy those arguments from primitive theology. Editorial fatigue, I think this ignores plausible harmonizations of passages. I think it saddles us with this implausible idea that the gospel authors are incredibly schizophrenic as they're copying from other gospels, that they're, forgetting the changes that they make within just a few sentences. And I think it's just this, I don't buy this whole assumption that, Mark, or rather, Luke, for example, is reading Mark's story of the feeding. I believe it's the feeding of the 5,000, and says, I just want to move this to Bethsaida for no reason at all. That's not consistent with how the gospel authors tell us that they're intending to write. I don't fundamentally buy the assumption that that's how the gospel authors are composing. As opposed to, or rather, regarding the issue of Mark being shorter, again, I think the charisma hypothesis that I put forward explains why Mark is shorter than the other two. If Mark is sort of intended to be a charismatic, sermon that kind of takes the important parts of Matthew and Luke and melds them together into a, shorter gospel that's going to be easier to distribute and such among unbelievers, that would perfectly well explain why Mark is shorter. If Markan priority can't stand on any one piece of evidence, then, it's not going to be helped at all by saying, well, it's all of them brought together. You can't stand on one piece, or you can't have the probability of the hypothesis increased at all by any one piece. 0 plus 0 still adds up to 0. You don't get any force from adding a bunch of these points together. He says he's not an expert on this and doesn't know a whole lot about it. Obviously I'm not an expert either, but I have tried to study it, right? Because, we're debating the issue, and I get neither of us is, a super synoptic scholar here, but, I think we're still capable of reasoning from the evidence. We can still look at it. I don't think scholars have special ways of knowing that aren't available to the rest of us. I just think that scholars, will hopefully have, invested more time and are going to be aware of more facts than the rest of us. But, I've looked at what the scholars have to say on this. There are holes in their reasoning. There are gaps in their reasoning. And I don't think you have to be a credentialed expert in order to, know that an argument is circular when you see it. You don't have to know that, you don't have to have a PhD in New Testament studies to recognize, that an argument is reversible. You just need to, have a kind of common sense grasp of basic logical reasoning. So yeah, I'll leave it at that.
John?
Yeah, textual criticism is quite the field. It's completely different from a different part of biblical scholarship, and it's unique. And most people that are textual critics tend to stay pretty focused in that exact section, and that is, it's just I know enough to know that I'm not adept. With that being said, Eusebius, writing a little over 300 years later. There's some people that would debate his honesty. I won't. I'll say that he probably was recording the best that he could, but I believe we've caught him redacting his own opinion quite a bit. I think it's a lot like Josephus. You have to have you have to look at his work with a certain lens. And while we're talking about Josephus, it's the same thing. His work has grown and it's been redacted and copied and mistakes made and everything else. And just because Eusebius being so far away, it just leaves a lot of suspect when we're talking about not having better sources. But anyway, with that being said, I'm not going to say I'm not going to go attacking him too much. I'm just saying we can't lean on Papias too much. With that being said, you did touch something that I do want to talk about, and that is the evolution of the resurrection mythology. And it's something that's strong and does point to Markan priority. So if we look at Pauline resurrection, we see a spiritual resurrection, but he's got a hybrid body. So it's not a physical resurrection. So it's not just, Jesus came out physical. And then that's our first account. Our next account, we have the Markan narrative. And Mark almost ignores resurrection completely. It's not even central to his theme. Now, he believed in resurrection and he touched on it, but it was far from important to him and his community. They really didn't focus on it, and it's not what they were teaching. And they did not teach a physical resurrection. And if you notice, there is a verse in there about Antipas. I'm probably saying the name not right, but with that being said, Antipas thought that John had been resurrected because Jesus' message was so similar. So they're giving you a Hellenistic version of resurrection that they're using that didn't have anything. It wasn't spiritual and it wasn't physical. We don't get a physical resurrection till we get into Luke and Matthew at a later date. And it just shows that the evolution of the resurrection mythology needed to be addressed. So people saw Mark and go, no freaking way. And there were so many different Christologies that existed early on. There wasn't one Christology, there was many. People believed that Jesus was all man. There were people that believed he was all God, like the Gnostics. And there was every single point in between on a 1 to 10 scale where different communities believed different things about Jesus Christology. And so the Christology that we have was evolving. Matthew his community believed in the physical resurrection. They found errors in the primitive Markan theology, and they found a very direct need to expand on the Markan resurrection mythology. So I'll just use that as one of many of the examples that Matthew and Luke expanded on, that needed to be expanded on a primitive form known as Mark. But then again, you don't want to say it's too primitive. Mark has got some absolutely amazing storytelling skills. There are some aspects that are primitive, but a lot of it isn't in modern scholarship. So anyway, I think that that's enough for me for now.
All right, Dave, 10 minutes.
All right. We had an interesting argument brought up here from the, supposed evolutionary development of the resurrection story. This is more kind of one of those things where I think we have an example of Markan priorists sort of I guess this is like the way they read things, and so then they interpret kind of the explanation as the evidence for it. So as I get it, like the idea is that we have this sort of not terribly developed resurrection story in Mark, like the resurrected Jesus doesn't even appear. It's just sort of predicted that these appearances are going to happen. And, it gets a little more developed as we get into Matthew and then into Luke and eventually the Gospel of John. And so what we see is a sort of evolutionary development. The problem with trying to use that as an argument for Markan priority is that it presupposes from the start that Mark was the first gospel to have been written. If Mark is not the first gospel to have been written, and we believe on sort of the basis of the factors that I listed, that, there's good reasons to think Matthew is first, and then there's Luke and then Mark, then, you sort of don't get that nice evolutionary pattern. So the problem is the pattern is a product of presupposing that Mark is the first gospel to have been written. If one rejects that assumption or is skeptical about it, as sort of in the present of the in the context of the debate that we're having, you can't use the presumption of Markan priority as an argument for Markan priority. That's just that's textbook circular reasoning. And I'll just say as a final point, I don't agree that the resurrection in Paul is spiritual at all. That's another debate we would have to have at another point in time. But I fundamentally don't grant that. I think Paul believes in a physical resurrection, much like what we would see in the canonical Gospels.
So do you both want to go ahead and move into the dialogue phase, where you both ask each other questions?
I'm good with that.
All right. We'll start now.
Do you want to go first, John? Did you have a question teed up?
I do not. I'm almost played out on this topic.
I hear. Well, I mean, I'd be curious to know, why do you think we have this sort of agreement among? And we don't have to make the whole debate about the patristics and the external evidence. It's a point I find interesting, and it doesn't get discussed like a whole lot, really, really hardly at all, except among evangelicals. But like among non-evangelical scholars, the external evidence is almost never brought up. And so I'm just kind of curious, from your perspective, what's the explanation for the unanimous agreement on the priority of Matthew?
Well, since it was the most popular, it's what they had heard about. And when you hold something dear, they didn't know what was first. So they didn't know. And the last thing that they could say was that the last thing they wanted to say, they're not going to admit to Matthew copying Mark. Even if it was the case, it's not something they would do. But again, we get so many different arguments up and down on, they rarely agreed on much. So the fact that they disagreed on the Matthean priority is just they agreed on Matthean priority is just one of many agreements and disagreements that the early patristics had. You get into a lot of trouble with the prose that all these texts were written in too. People have to remember, one, you have to read these texts through a Hellenistic lens, and two, these were all written under Aristotelian rhetorical prose. And the whole object of the Gospels, the biblical text, the patristics, everything was meant to persuade the audience. We're talking about illiterate oral cultures. And these texts were meant to be written. So instead of going to a movie today to see a movie that rarely resembles maybe a slight historical core, it was almost identical for all these texts. They were meant to be written aloud, written not to be read literally either, but they were meant to be to persuade the crowd to your opinion. They were sales pieces. Even the historical pieces like Josephus were not accurate. We have to look at, like a lot of his work, it mirrors his desires and what he wanted to sell. And it's no different in the biblical text. Each community had versions of Jesus that they wanted to sell over another version. And really, when you look at how the scribes that wrote these were trained to write, it doesn't make any sense to make a minimized version of Mark. And it's just how I see I guess I am trained in the Aristotelian rhetorical prose very well, that the scribes used. And that was actually when I learned that, it was an eye opener, and it made lights click on for the synoptic study. That was quite the amazing day.
So let me agree with you that I do agree that the Gospels are, they're obviously, trying to persuade people. That's pretty clear in them. I mean, in particular, I know John's not one of the synoptics, but at the end, it's abundantly clear. I think I would disagree with you that being written to persuade someone is, I don't think that's incompatible with writing a historically accurate narrative. But that's obviously a debate for another day. To return to sort of the issue of priority, I understand your answer to my question of sort of why is there agreement on the priority of Matthew? It's because it's the most popular. My response to that is to say sort of, okay, but then why is Matthew the most popular gospel of the bunch? My answer to that is because Matthew's the first gospel to have been written. So this is the one that people have had the longest. This is the one they're the most familiar with. So this is why it's this is why it's the most popular one. So in that sense, I don't see it being the most popular as being a rival hypothesis to that it's also first. Instead, I see those as sort of being complementary and mutually supporting hypotheses. It's the most popular gospel precisely because it's the first gospel. What do you think of that sort of reasoning?
I don't find it as compelling in any way, and the reason being is it's more popular, one, because it held on to Judaism, to the Hellenistic Judaism, much tighter than the others. And so, and when you read Luke, it's a fancy tale. It's designed to intrigue the audience so that you want to flip another page to really engage the audience in the text. Matthew held on to the religious. It just had the right balance, but it also had a complete story of Jesus where Mark didn't. So if you read Mark and you read Matthew and you're given a choice between the two, Matthew gives you the birth narrative that Mark doesn't give. It gets into the Christ, the physical resurrection that was growing and evolving. It gets into a lot of the details, but it keeps the basic core of the story because Mark was so valuable. It was just what it was floating around, and compared to some of the other stories, this was some of the best. The more popular stories that existed, whether it be Mark or Matthew, they were all very popular. But Matthew became, when I say popular, Matthew became, it started out popular and it finished popular. But we're talking about a 15-year difference. And so that is where you would run into trouble with that particular hypothesis, substantiating a 15-year difference. We just don't see it. So that it making a huge difference in popularity when it tells quite the story. So I feel that just the expanded version of Mark alone made it popular.
Okay. I'll give you the last word on this before we can switch to talking about some of the internal evidence, because I'd be curious about your thoughts on that as well. But sure. Just my final thoughts in response to what you just said. Is that Luke and John also have complete stories. Luke also has a birth story, arguably a better one than Matthew does. So I don't think that just saying Matthew has a more complete story is going to be sufficient to explain Matthew's popularity among the patristics. And then also this bit about, Matthew having, holding on the most to Hellenistic Judaism. I don't see in the patristics any interest in holding on to Hellenistic Judaism. That doesn't seem to me to be a concern when I read Irenaeus, when I read Origen, when I read Augustine. None of them seem interested in holding on to Hellenistic Judaism, so I also don't see why that would be a good explanation for why it was the most popular. Let
me give a short rebuttal on that really quick, because the New Testament is a product of Hellenistic Judaism. You had with, again, the early Christians, you had a minimum of 300,000 pilgrims going in and out of Passover for the 3 decades that the temple stood. And these 300,000 people were going back. And so Hellenistic Judaism, it started it was very popular before the Herodian temple was rebuilt, but Herod rebuilt that temple as a way to give Hellenistic Judaism and monotheism to the Roman Empire. The Christianity was the divorce of Hellenistic Judaism from Aramaic and traditional cultural Judaism that were known as rebellious Jews. And so you're not going to see them talk when Hellenistic Jews talk about Judaism or Christianity, they refer to it just as Judaism. They don't say it's Hellenistic Judaism. But the fact is, all the Gospels are a product of the Roman Empire, and they're all Hellenistic texts, and it's all talking about Hellenistic Judaism. When I say Hellenistic Judaism, I'm making sure our audience understands. There's a different Judaism from Peter and Matthew than the Hellenistic Jews that were coming in and out of the temple. And I'll also say the reason Jesus was crucified was because he caused trouble in the Hellenistic temple because of those differences in Judaism. He caused trouble where he shouldn't have, and his crucifixion perceived as the ultimate sacrifice. Anyway, that's how you're not going to have Hellenistic Jews or Hellenistic Christians mentioning Hellenism, because that was the world that they lived in. So it's like saying me saying USA in front of everything I'm going to say just because I'm saying it. So that's why you don't see it said. But when they're talking about Judaism, they're not talking about any other Judaism than the Hellenistic Judaism, because that's the only Judaism they knew from the Septuagint. So I probably said that wrong too, but fair enough.
All right. I said I'd give you the last word on that one. So we can move on to maybe some of the more internal considerations. So on the issue of conflation, right, I'm kind of curious what you make of Mark 1:32, right? We have this phrase, now when evening came, right? Or that's the English translation of it. I won't try to say the Greek translation because I'm sure my pronunciation will be way off. But this sort of introductory statement. It's very, very characteristic of Matthew's gospel. We've got it turning up 6 times in his gospel, and then we have it occurring only once in Mark, and then nowhere else in the New Testament. So 7 total occurrences, 6 in Matthew, 1 in Mark. What this indicates to me is that the phrase is characteristic of Matthew's gospel. He's the one who likes to use this phrase. And so if it turns up in Mark, what that suggests to me is Mark is getting this phrase from Matthew rather than Matthew is getting this phrase from Mark. What do you think of that?
I think it could work either way. I think you
He's breaking up there.
I just can't see a point one way or the other. And the problem with some of these minor things that you're mentioning out, since we have copies of copies of copies, and we know that there's multiple different copies, and we're far removed. We're looking at text today that is not the same text that was circulated in the 1st and 2nd and even the 3rd century. There's difference in our earliest 3rd century text is not the same as what we have, and there's so many different versions. I don't like to get caught up or hung up in wordplay like this. Again, that's where I believe the textual critics would have a more precise answer, and you're asking me to give you something precise that we really can't know due to having copies of copies. So even if it was the original, let's assume for the sake of argument that it was that this was the version that you're using was original. I don't think that it gives a case, because for this you could say the criticism would be that simply Matthew liked what he saw in Mark and he expanded on it multiple times. So that would be what I would posit for that hypothesis.
Yeah, okay. So regarding the textual point, I'm not aware of any textual dispute over this passage. You know, there's no variance here. This is a pretty well acknowledged fact that the phrase commonly occurs in Matthew and only occurs once. But you did seem willing to
No,
grant that.
I agree. I agree with you on that. But I'm just saying there are so many small details that changed over the centuries that we don't have the original forms. And so I hate getting caught up on small wordplay when there's possibilities that things could have changed through the later copies. So that's all I'm saying. And I'll even give it to you that it is the original for the sake of argument. But okay. I just making sure that people understand that point.
For sure. But I mean, so I mean, this is just basic inductive reasoning, right? If we know that a phrase is characteristic of one author, right? We've got inductive evidence then that, you know, the phrase is original to him and is not copied over from somebody who only uses the phrase once. What you gave to explain this seems to me to be kind of an ad hoc hypothesis, which, you know, is fine because, I mean, I think any synoptic theory to some extent is going to include some ad hoc hypotheses. It's a complex problem. We've all got, you know, rough parts where we have to import ad hoc hypotheses. So, like, if you had independent good reasons to be a Markan priorist, I could, you know, see you going this route with, you know, Matthew saying, oh, I like that phrase in Mark, and then, you know, replicating it 6 times in his own gospel. But on its own, that's certainly not the best explanation of the evidence. That's an ad hoc hypothesis, which is just being, you know, brought in to explain.
Really quickly, and I don't mean to interrupt, but I'll forget if I don't say it now. I have a terrible memory, short-term memory. The fact that he only did it once, if he did it 6 times, and if he was copying Matthew, then yes, you could say, you know, what but he only did it once. And again, I guess that would go along with the him simplifying Matthew. So I understand how that argument would apply. Again, I think there's equal criticism, ad hoc or not, both ways. I don't find it compelling that one has 6 and one has 1, and you never know. So I'm not sure if you're aware of how these texts came to be. It wasn't a single author sitting down and writing things down. And what you there we go. You would have a bunch.
We might be losing John.
Let's give him a second.
You would have people sitting around telling the scribe what to write and how to write it. And this is where, like, the mythicists get in trouble with a lot of interpolation claims. Is one person in the room could say, hey, you forgot this, add this. The scribe would add that. And instantly it looks like an interpolation that a later where a later redaction took place. And that wasn't the case. It's just a fact that these texts are a community production, and things exactly like what you're talking about is kind of par for the course when people are saying, you know, put this in, add this. And it wasn't as simple as having a scribe and sitting in a room by himself and having one text where he was copying the other. It was never like that. These were always community pieces. So that's one explanation that might help to strengthen or weaken your argument if you'd like to expand on it in the future.
Yeah, I mean, I fundamentally not agree with you that that's the way that the Gospels were written, but you know, I don't want to have that debate here.
That was
it seems to me that
by my Harvard professor.
It seems to me that the best response for the Markan priorists here is to say, okay, yeah, that's a piece of evidence for Matthaean priority, but we've just got much better evidence for Markan priority. What about the redundancy present in Mark here, right? We've got him saying, now when evening came after the sun had set, right? 2 different ways of saying the same thing. One follows Matthew, one follows Luke. Now, on the hypothesis you're putting forward, it seems to me that Luke and Matthew have, but for some reason, Mark is writing redundantly, even though we know that redundancy is something that kind of...
What do you mean redundantly? Just expand on that, please.
So when he says, now when evening came after the sun had set, 2 different ways of saying the same thing. Right? It's a redundant statement in Mark. It seems like you're going to have the redundancy be an original thing in Mark, and then for some reason Matthew and Luke are, you know, independently preserving opposite parts of the redundancy there, right? And we've got 17 examples of this, right? 17 examples where Matthew and Luke are apparently like just preserving polar opposite parts. And I mean, this isn't even a harder problem for your hypothesis, it seems to me, because you think that Matthew and Luke are independent, right? So it's not even like Luke is able to be like, Matthew preserved those parts of Mark, so I'm going to preserve the opposite parts here. So kind of what's going on? Is this just like a coincidence that they both just so happen to preserve opposite portions of, these various parts of Mark? They were only preserving the parts that, the other author had not preserved. What's the explanation there?
So this is actually a good conversation that I've had with Jacob quite a bit. As far as Luke and Matthew and what they knew about each other, again, when I say it's a community effort making these texts, no one wrote alone. This was always generally a community. So each household, these texts came out of a paterfamilias. And in a paterfamilias, you generally had a large group of people, your neighbors, and an extended family with you. With that being said, you would have, I'm trying to figure out the best way to put this. So if you had let's just say for argument's sake that there was 10 people in the room, in the room of Luke and Matthew while they were being dictating to a scribe. You could have had 2 or 3 people that heard all of Luke or Matthew, vice versa, or had heard portions of it that sat in for a chapter or 2. So there's possible, and there were the traditions were, there were a lot of different traditions. So if you want to call it cross-contamination is a high possibility, and I don't discount it. What I do discount, though, is them having a copy of Luke and Matthew sitting next to each other while each one was written. We in academia, we kind of think that there's a 10 to 20 year difference. And for Matthew to circulate, how far did Matthew get circulated in 10 to 20 years? I don't think it was widely known in 10 to 20 years. I think that it made its ground into some of the popular cities. So again, due to the Roman roads and how people traveled, word got around, the text got around. And remember, once the temple was gone, a lot of the interaction that took place early on was lessened when you had to rely on the Roman roads instead of hundreds of thousands of people gathering and sharing traditions. That's why I mentioned about the temple in when I first started in originality. But there really is no debate in academia that these were community efforts. So I'd love to I wish I could sit down and talk with you and tell you how I was taught. But it's not the time or place for it. And so I won't get into that debate right now.
We could debate the issue of authorship, and
right.
I'm happy to have that debate.
I just meant the Aristotelian rhetorical prose and the community effort.
But to be clear, are you saying that you don't think that, like, Matthew, for example, was directly copying from a Gospel of Mark, and that instead he's getting this sort of orally, or that the various community is getting this orally? And
absolutely not. So okay. Mark actually, the author of Matthew actually had a copy of Mark at hand. So, and I believe that Luke did too. When it comes to Luke and Matthew, did Luke know how much did Luke know Matthew? That's all I'm saying. I'm saying that there's a possibility. We can't look at the 10 people in the room as a whole. All 10 of them did not hear or know this information. And how many of them knew what percentage of what? I wouldn't even begin to try to answer that question. I'm just saying it's a high possibility that the Lucan authors or the Lucan community had some knowledge, had a little or partial knowledge. Other way, and we don't see that many people attributing Lucan priority, but they're out there, and I don't find any of their cases as convincing as Matthean priority.
Yeah. I mean, my own best friend is actually, he believes in Lucan priority, so I know that they are. I know they're out there probably better than most, and I agree with you. I don't find the case for a Lucan priority very strong. You cut out a little bit, but from what I was able to put together, so you do agree, obviously, that there's literary dependence then going on here. So,
Oh, yes, yes, sir.
Is the explanation then for why Matthew and Luke are preserving like the opposite portions of Mark, like because for you the explanation, obviously, it can't be that Mark is melding these together. That seems to me to be the best explanation. But so for you, they're picking out independent ones. Is this because as communities, somebody or certain people in the community sort of know that, say Matthew has already preserved these parts of Mark, and so these members of the community are saying to, or the people in the Lucan community are saying like, well, we don't need to include those portions of Mark because someone else already did it. Is that the explanation?
So imagine this: you're in a city. These cities, some of them were larger than others, but you had people coming and gathering with you. And when you're sitting around writing something, well, I heard this, I heard that. But what I'm trying to say is the Matthaean community and the Lucan community and the Markan community, regardless of what's written, had completely different views of Jesus and what Jesus' martyrdom had meant to them. So Mark wrote a completely different Christology and resurrection. So your argument would apply to basically what you're lining out lines up for all of them. They all had different views, but what they aren't arguing on is the core of the story, that Jesus died at Passover, that he was resurrected, and how profound and they're basically the lifeline of events. If you notice, all three of the synoptic gospels are basically dealing with the last 2 weeks of Jesus' life. And a lot of that is due to that's what the Hellenistic Passover attendance, that's all they knew. So what I see is a large break between the Hellenistic Christians, and I don't view the real Aramaic followers as Christians. I believe they remain just steadfast, pious Jews as Galileans were known to be. I don't think that they bought into any part of this Christianity. It's why that Peter argued with Paul. It's why that Paul didn't come to any agreement with them. And it's why we have no sources from the Jerusalem church in a place that had a lot of scribes and a lot of people coming in and out. We should have had, if Peter and James were if Christians, which were basically Hellenistic Jews, they weren't Christians early on. They were Christian Jews, if you will. Anyway, there was a split between the Aramaic followers and the Hellenistic communities, like Paul and the gospel authors. There's a reason that Mark claims that Peter is the devil. There's a reason that Mark says, none of you Aramaic followers understand Jesus' true message. The Gospels, the Synoptics are loaded with polemic against the Aramaic, the true followers of Jesus. And that's because they remained steadfast and they had a different version than what was being produced in the Hellenistic communities like Paul and the Gospel authors. So when Paul mixes with the real Aramaic followers, we have a conflict of interest. And they don't agree. And that's all we get out of the 12 followers of Jesus, the supposed 12 followers of Jesus. I personally don't believe that there were 12. I find that as a later development in early Hellenistic Christianity. But with that being said, I'll let you expand on your topic. Sorry to get sidetracked. It ties into what you're saying.
Yeah, I guess I'm not really seeing how that explains why we're getting opposite portions of the Markan narrative preserved in Matthew and Luke, respectively. We can move on from this. Just a point I would highlight from my side. This is why I find the case. This is largely why I'm a Matthaean priorist, right? It's that we're getting ad hoc hypothesis stacked up on ad hoc hypothesis to explain, why Matthew looks the way he does, why Mark looks the way he does. And the justification for these ad hoc hypotheses is usually well, we've just got such great evidence for Markan priority. And again, in theory, that can work, but I don't think the evidence for Markan priority is that good in general. And so if you have questions for me, I'm happy to give you a chance to ask.
Well, this is, again, I keep referring to this because I'm trying to let it sink into our audience's head. When we talk about the historicity of Jesus and why he has such strong historicity, yet the only two universal aspects that he has historicity is the baptism by John and the crucifixion under Caiaphas and Pilate. That's the only certainties when we talk about the historical Jesus. There is no one piece of text that builds historicity. It's the totality of evidence, and it is ad hoc, personal, educated opinions from the best scholars in the world that give Jesus his historicity. And the same exact things applied to the Markan traditions. And again, it just comes down, and I understand you're making a decent case for it, but what you would need to overturn the consensus, the almost consensus, majority, you don't even argue that it is a majority, but the reason it is a majority isn't because of ad hoc arguments. It's the totality of evidence in support of the highest educated people on the planet right now see in their vast opinion the priority of Mark making more sense than Matthaean priority. So I appreciate your conversation. You're a gentleman and you're a friend, and it's why I had the conversation with you. I think the best thing you did was add me as a friend on Facebook, because I would not take the gloves off, and you're actually doing me a favor because you're keeping me more civil. So I do appreciate your friendship, my friend.
Yeah, no, I mean, you've been a perfectly decent guy. I've got no problems with you. Just I guess the issue with the difference here might be, I think you put a lot more evidential weight in sort of scholarly opinion than, for example, I would. My thinking on this is, I mean, first of all, there's a question to be considered of sort of which scholarly consensus are we talking about. Obviously, the contemporary one overwhelmingly favors Markan priority, but, you go back in time, if we're considering the full range of scholars across time, Matthaean priority was, the dominant theory actually for, the majority of time, even among, biblical scholars up until, last 150, 200 years when, B.H. Streeter and other scholars made Markan priority more popular. But just that to say, if we're actually looking at the full range of scholars that have ever existed on this topic, it's actually not clear to me that the majority of them are going to favor Markan priority. Certainly the majority of contemporary ones do. Fundamentally, for me, I just think that's the wrong way to look at it. I don't put that much evidential weight in a scholarly consensus. And here's another thing to note about the consensus point, too, is while among broadly New Testament scholars, Markan priority is the dominant position, that percentage actually goes down as you focus on scholars who specialize in the synoptic problem. That is to say, the ratio is different for scholars who specialize in the synoptic problem versus New Testament scholars more generally. No, that's not to say that the majority of those who specialize in the synoptic problem are not Markan prioris. The majority of them are. It's just to say it's not as large of a majority. So the actual specialists in this area have considerably more disagreement on the issue. But yeah, I mean, I just think there are systematic problems in New Testament studies. I think there's just way too much sort of reliance on speculation. There's too much, with all due respect to you, John, I think you've done some of it in this debate. There's, reading, motives into, for example, in Mark having Jesus, tell, Peter, say, get behind me, Satan, to Peter. Thinking that this is supposed to be some sort of polemic, whereas, I have a much simpler view. I just think it really happened, and that Mark is reporting it that way because that's the way it occurred. And so I think that there's this tendency in New Testament studies to read these deep things into some statements in the New Testament that I don't see that they're meant to be read that way. And I get we're coming at this from very different, perspectives and things like that. But I guess that's my thought on it. Is I think for us it just comes down to how much weight we put in scholarly consensus.
right? So I wish you could take the classes that I took. So if you go to Harvard, Princeton, or Yale, and you look at the professors and you sit and you listen to their sermons and what they're teaching, everything is evidence-based, and they generally, so they don't, if you read one of his books, Mr. Ehrman is telling you his opinion. He's not teaching you how to form a historical opinion. When you take a class at Yale, Harvard, or Princeton, or any of the best universities in the world, they teach you how to form these opinions based on the evidence of what we know and what we don't know. And part of that is learning every aspect of anthropology so that you can understand the communities that produce these texts. It gives you a wider field of vision that you normally wouldn't see. I just happened to start out debating mythicists for a decade before I even got an academic education, and I got into the intricate details of evidence. And that's part of the reason why it doesn't do any good to get into an evidence-based discussion with a mythicist when there is no one piece of evidence. And it's the same thing why I didn't discuss a lot of it with you, because if you were a good textual critic, you could come up with and you were a good philosophical debater, you'd make me look silly. Even if my evidence was strong, a good debater is going to use his philosophical skills to get around the evidence at hand. And I had enough of that with the mythicists. I think we're attacking this in a way that our audience can understand the way with what we're doing, and it doesn't rely on specific details. And the whole thing is I could have listed many details in support of Markan authorship, but you could also counter them. There's a lot of good, and if you read about any of the people that put these out, there is no smoking gun as far as the evidence is concerned for such.
Well, Mark Goodacre might disagree. He seems to put a lot of weight in editorial fatigue as kind of that's his
field of study, is that editorial fatigue, and now he goes for you said he has Matthean priority.
No. So he's going to be.
That's what I understood too.
Yeah, he's going to be Ferrer-Golder hypothesis.
Yeah,
so
the Markan priority, correct.
Yeah, he'd go Mark. He would disagree with you on two sources. He doesn't think that Q exists.
Right.
So he thinks.
I am actually, I find my hypothesis more credible than his, because he's actually making a stand, and I don't think we have enough evidence to say written or oral. And all we can say is that Matthew and Luke used a similar source. And again, when we get into how much Luke knew Matthew or Matthew knew the Lucan narrative, we don't know. And so I wish we did. I wish we knew enough to make that stand. As an example of that stand, it's like when Carrier got off the fence. He used to be agnostic about the historicity of Jesus. And I think his downfall was once he picked sides and decided that he was going to make a case for mythicism by copying Doherty's hypothesis, or not copying, but using the Jesus puzzle hypothesis from Earl's work.
Yes, well, we can agree that Carrier is well, maybe you wouldn't go this far. I would say Carrier is something of a hack. I haven't been terribly impressed with it.
I'll go further, but I'm not going to do any name calling so that Mr. Berman doesn't have to edit anything, because I'll get myself into trouble, put it that way.
That's fair. Yeah, I don't know.
I think we're both studying I think we're both fighting on the right side, and we just have a few minor disagreements over a topic that you think is debated a little more than me. I kind of think that it's settled and follow the academic consensus, and you think that there's work that needs to be done, and I applaud you for giving it a good attempt.
Yeah, and to be fair, it's not hugely debated. Like, obviously, since probably the early 2000s, there hasn't been a whole lot of debate between the Markan and Matthaean priorists. But most of that's just due to the fact that most of the Matthaean priorists either, died or retired and aren't a part of the active conversation. I don't think it's because their arguments were ever.
You bring up something good that I wanted to touch on. And with the older scholarships, we know so much more today than we ever did 100 years ago. There's no comparison in our knowledge base now, and how much knowledge has been discovered in the last 100 years with the Gnostic text and everything else, and then the work combined on them. You also had a lot of apologetic does, and a lot of a neat thing that, because I take a neutral stance, I tried to find problems. And at first, when I heard a lot of sermons a lot of lectures actually just ended up being down the middle as you could be. And it was amazing at how down the middle they could be. So I'd just like to say, I don't see what you might call secular or atheistic. I don't think that there is such a thing as secular poisoning, and there is definitely there's uneducated atheists that comment, and I have as much a problem with them as I do the apologist on the far left and the atheist on the far right. I have problems with both, and I find that the problem is a lack of education that gives them set opinions. And I wish more people were middle centric, and I'm glad that you're more middle centric. And again, I at least you don't find the Hebrew Matthew plausible, because there's just no evidence for it at this time. And if there was, awesome. I'll go which way the evidence points.
Yeah, I mean, my reason for not affirming a Hebrew Matthew, again, is largely because I think that's based on a misreading of Papias and Irenaeus. It's not for like the typical, like I'm not of the opinion that like our Greek Matthew absolutely could not be translation Greek. So my reasons are a little bit different, but yeah, I don't particularly affirm that. I'm not sure if we got a whole lot of a place to go from here, Jake.
Yeah, do you both want to close here?
Fair enough. I have nothing really to add.
All right. I'll go ahead and play the outro. Thank you both for debating, keeping it civil. And that being said, I'll have a link to David Pallmann's YouTube channel in the description below if anyone wants to go over there and subscribe. And that being said, thank you both again.
Have a great day. Thank you.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.